It was just after 2 a.m. on a night so dark the roads seemed to swallow sound, when a convoy, heavy with secrets and quiet intentions, pulled off a federal highway in western Mexico under the thin sliver of moonlight, its tires cutting the blacktop like whispers. No screams. Just engines fading, shadows sliding out of view. The next morning, charred wreckage, burned-out trucks, shattered glass, but no bodies. Whoever drove that convoy had vanished, leaving only questions and the smell of smoke. Around dawn, a smashed smartphone was discovered among the ashes. Cracked screen, call log still intact, GPS pings placing it deep inside both cartel territories, Sinaloa and Jalisco. Names half-whispered, code words, timestamps. Nothing that officially links a command to blood, but everything that hints at where the flame started. This one phone, a discarded scrap of metal and circuitry, would become the fuse in a war that many tried to ignore until it was burning through entire cities. It exposed alliances built in darkness, betrayals whispered in safe houses, loyalties paid with silence. The old guard in Sinaloa saw their control fraying, the new generation in Jalisco felt opportunity crawling like vines into territories long thought safe. Not long after, the killings spilled into daylight. Roadblocks appeared overnight. Neighbors dared not open windows. In Culican, on September 9, 2024, the sky filled with helicopters, the earth with gunfire, when the sons of El Chapo, known as Los Chapitos, squared off with La Maiza, the faction claiming loyalty to Ismael El Mayo Zambada. A radio transmission, allegedly ordering send Los Chapitos straight to hell, echoed across encrypted channels. The violence that followed was brutal in scale, streets turned into kill zones, bodies hanging from bridges, white vans found with men shot or missing, once safe neighborhoods abandoned. Families packed what they could. Schools closed. Businesses boarded windows. Fear became routine, every car, every cell phone looked like a risk. And yet, all of that was only the opening move. Over in Jalisco, a different sort of ambition was rising, led by a cartel known as CJNG, whose leader, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho, had watched opportunity open when the old structures in Sinaloa wavered. Where Sinaloa once negotiated, CJNG broadcast. Where Sinaloa stayed in shadows, CJNG leaned into social media, banners in public, narcomantas leaving threats on walls. The major question: how do you fight a war when your enemy is everyone around you, when the old alliances are dissolving, when public officials can't be trusted, when a phone call or a contact list can kill you? Because in this war, something terrible is true: violence isn't the exception. It's the rule. The wreckage in Sinaloa, the power grabs in Jalisco, the internal feuds in Sinaloa between Los Chapitos and La Maiza, all of it points to something far bigger than turf. It points to a rupture, old empire versus insurgent brutality. Resource versus raw aggression. A cartel war that doesn't stay on highways. It enters your home, your phone, your normal day. For months, deaths and disappearances mounted, 20 bodies discovered in Sinaloa June 2025, some decapitated and hung from bridges, others crammed into vans, the message clear. Civil life in Culican, once buzzing with radios and commerce, shut down. Grocery stores emptied, markets sparse, the city under siege in broad daylight. And behind all this carnage, there are whispers: corruption at high levels, collusion between law enforcement and crime syndicates, U.S. pressure, synthetic drugs flooding in, supply routes shifting, loyalty lines redraw themselves in real time. By the end of this hour, by the end of this video, you will see how the war extends far beyond bullets. How the phone that was left at dawn, the bridge where bodies hung, the banners in the streets, they are all part of a story of power, raw, unrestrained, networked, and brutal. Stay. Because what you believe about this war now will be challenged, and the truth is not usually what's loudest. It's what's hidden. And we start now.
You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story.
Long before banners draped city walls, before bridges dripped messages in blood, there were farms in the mountains of Sinaloa and hidden valleys in Jalisco where crops of marijuana and poppies swayed in the wind, as farmers learned that the earth could feed more than mouths, it could feed empires. In the 1960s and 1970s, local traffickers carved secret paths through the Sierra Madre, smuggling small loads of cannabis north into the United States. Over time, those clandestine routes matured into forged alliances, into cross-state networks that traded silence for profit. In Sinaloa, a man named Pedro Aviles Perez is often cited as one of the earliest pioneers, connecting isolated growers to the smuggling lanes. From that modest genesis, others emerged, budding operators who understood that in Mexico, geography is destiny. The rugged mountains, the hidden valleys, the long Pacific coastlines, all of it gave cover, routes, and breathing room when law enforcement poked its head. Over decades, alliances formed with traffickers from Guadalajara, Sonora, Chihuahua, and even with cartel networks in the United States. Meanwhile, in Jalisco and nearby states like Michoacán and Michoacán's borderlands, small criminal groups played their parts: farm laborers, extortion squads, local protection rackets. When the Milenio Cartel emerged, drawing on some of those local threads, a new chapter began. That cartel would later fracture, and from its ruins rose a group that would not merely survive, it would contest empire. Over time, the Sinaloa network consolidated. Under leaders like Héctor Palma Salazar, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, and eventually Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, the cartel adapted: tunnels, bribes, hidden labs, alliances in politics and law enforcement. In the 1980s and 90s, as Colombia traffickers funneled cocaine toward Mexican ports, Sinaloa moved from small cargoes to major cartel status. The Guadalajara cartel's breakup in the late 1980s opened a vacuum, and Sinaloa stepped into it. Yet dominance was never static. Within Sinaloa itself, factions formed. The Beltran Leyva organization, the Arellano Felix lines, even internal feuds, each fracture demanded recalibration. Through successful prison breaks, deep bribery networks, and rungs of enforcement, the cartel maintained its grip even when its kingpins fell. At the same time, Jalisco's heirs to the Milenio network were changing fast. When leaders were arrested, or power vacuums emerged, an ambitious successor named Nemesio El Mencho Oseguera Cervantes pushed outward. He transformed what had been more of a gang division into a cartel, one that not only trafficked, but governed, intimidated, and pulverized rivals. By 2009, CJNG was born from cracks in the Milenio Cartel and from alliances originally tied to Sinaloa's federation. But unlike the slow, networked approach of Sinaloa's older generation, CJNG moved with shock. It struck bridges, exposed corruption, publicly challenged institutional power, and grew faster than many predicted. The difference between the two was striking. Sinaloa's machine ran in whispers, built in corridors, cautious, adaptable. CJNG's was loud, banners on walls, videos released on social media, threats broadcast in public squares. While the older cartel negotiated its influence, CJNG demanded it, dared you to oppose it, and often punished the boldest. By the mid-2010s, both had grown into vast networks, Sinaloa controlling vast swathes of the Pacific coast, drug routes north, corrupt officials in many states, CJNG branching into 27 of Mexico's 32 states, diversifying into extortion, oil theft, kidnapping, and surveillance tactics. Their footprints overlapped, their ambitions collided, and tension had become inevitable. But a map is cold. The real battleground lies in choices, when a leader must decide whether to fight or concede, when a lieutenant switches sides, when an encrypted phone call leaps the divide. And now, we approach that moment, when the calm breaks and the first shot is fired. In the dead of night, under a sky so dark it swallowed radio static, the convoy that had slipped from Culican moved toward Jalisco's edge. Armed guards sat alert, engines humming low, unaware that the road ahead had already been rewired for violence. At precisely 2:17 a.m., gunmen struck from the flanks. Automatic fire erupted, tires shredded, vehicles lurched, and men dove into ditches. What had seemed like a routine operation dissolved into chaos in seconds: flashbangs, tracer rounds lighting the asphalt, backup vehicles unable to advance. The ambush wasn't a gamble, it was a calculated assault on control itself. In those first harrowing moments, numbers were everything: how many shooters, how many trucks, the flanking distance, the timing. Eyewitnesses later described columns of smoke rising, bodies cast aside, the stench of burning rubber filling the air. Some trucks were disabled, some pushed over embankments, others forced to turn back under fire. The attackers left no margin for chaos. They had rehearsed, they had chosen that site, that curvature, that narrow pass where the convoy would be exposed. The casualties were immediate. Several guards and escorts were cut down mid-drive. Some managed to flee into brush or darkness, their radios scrambling. Others, caught, never surfaced in official reports. By dawn, trucks lay abandoned, doors swung open, packages torn, and the asphalt scarred by shell casings and tire tracks that led into nowhere. From that ambush point, the war spilled outward, not just physical, but informational, psychological, territorial. When word of the ambush spread, panic and suspicion rippled through both cartels' networks. In Sinaloa, internal factions whispered that the attack came from within, a betrayal. In Jalisco, commanders gloated quietly, this was proof that their reach had extended. Alliances began to shift overnight. Sub-leaders in border towns that once pledged loyalty to Sinaloa started to hedge their bets, offering neutral stances or even tacit support to CJNG's growing claims. A lieutenant in Nayarit reportedly told local contact, "We'll stay out until the smoke settles." That kind of gamble would cost many their lives. Casualties mounted beyond the ambush site. In smaller towns near the conflict zone, bodies began surfacing, some killed in drive-by shootings, others found in fields outside highway frontage. Witnesses spoke of convoys rerouted at night, supplied by new corridors, and of spotters on rooftops in towns that until days before had been quiet. The violence was no longer limited to the highways, it was becoming territorial. Cartel-influenced signage reappeared, banners, graffiti, public warnings. The message, "Your silence is paid for." Jalisco's operatives, emboldened, began to colonize micro-territories previously ignored. In towns along the border of Sinaloa, they distributed supplies, offered protection, or threatened local business owners. In some cases they moved into trafficking corridors, demanding tolls from smaller operators who had long been under Sinaloa's umbrella. And when those operators tried to resist, they were met with violence, kidnappings, disappearances, messaging. While bullets flew and alliances fractured, the war went public. Cartels began to broadcast their strength. Video banners, narcomantas, appeared overnight draped across bridges, reading threats in black spray, names crossed out, demands made. In Jalisco, CJNG released online videos showing captured fighters, bloodied bodies, forceful claims to territory. In Sinaloa, the older faction responded in whispers, delayed statements, denials, rumors of outside agitators. Meanwhile, local reporters found themselves caught in crossfire, offices shot up, journalists threatened, coverage limited by fear. The propaganda was artful. In one released clip, masked shooters walked calmly through a border town, planting a banner and spraying slogans. The voiceover declared, "This territory now answers to Jalisco." Another dropped footage of burned trucks, civilians fleeing, accompanied by text, "Your silence was payment, our presence is now governance." On social media, the clips went viral. Local citizens posted their fears, images of police absent on main roads, videos of convoys passing in dawn. The narrative was shifting in real time. Intimidation followed. Business owners who once paid protection to Sinaloa were visited by emissaries of CJNG, enforce contracts, they said, or face inconvenience. In some towns, phone calls warned, "You will disappear if you open your shop tomorrow." In rural roads, drivers were stopped, licenses checked, phones confiscated, photos taken. The rules were now being written in fear, printed on walls, broadcast on phones, enforced by both bullet and algorithm. But the state's response trailed behind. Local police forces, underpaid and under threat, scrambled to respond. Some units blocked highways, others withdrew from conflict zones to avoid ambush. Federal agents were deployed, but often too late, too light, too exposed. In one region just outside Culican, troops arrived hours after bodies were removed, evidence compromised, phones wiped. In Guerrero and Colima, clashes between Sinaloa and CJNG had already escalated. For example, Colima long been seen as a battleground over the port of Manzanillo. The terrain was leaking danger in all directions. The police blamed chain of command breakdowns, interference from corrupt officials, and lack of coordination. Journalists report that some officers refused deployments unless reassured of payment or safe promise. In some towns, entire stations were compromised, constables missing, or suspected of tipping cartel movements. The state's grid showed holes, gaps that cartel foot soldiers and informants poured through like water. By the time the smoke cleared from the ambush site, the war had already rewritten law enforcement's map, checkpoints shuttered, patrols scaled back, local governments in crisis, and the question on federal lips, where do we strike first? Amid the chaos, investigators recovered that same cracked smartphone from the ambush. The calls logged within it, the timestamps, the GPS pings, they hinted at something no one expected. A name. A location. A betrayal. The phone recovered at the scene revealed something no one expected. By the time the sun rose on the third month of fighting, both cartels had learned a hard truth: survival wasn't about bravery anymore, it was about systems. The war that had begun with ambushes and open road shootouts was now mutating into a logistical arms race. Both sides were rebuilding their machines from the inside out: communications, financing, recruitment, surveillance. The weapons weren't just rifles anymore, they were routers, satellites, and encrypted servers buried deep in ranch basements and safe houses disguised as legitimate farms. In the outskirts of Guadalajara, technicians worked in the shadows, setting up private networks using mesh signals and hacked repeater towers to transmit orders undetected. In Culiacan, coders linked encrypted messaging groups across continents, ensuring that every move, every payment, every truck, every bribe, could be tracked and erased with one click. The cartels had become data organizations as much as they were narcotics empires, learning the lessons of corporations and militaries alike: efficiency is dominance, speed is survival. The smuggling routes themselves shifted like serpents under sand. When one port was tightened by federal surveillance, two new corridors opened, one through rural Sonora, another through maritime routes off the Pacific coast. Fishermen were paid triple to ferry sealed containers under the cover of night. Truckers drove with GPS blind spots deliberately coded into their navigation devices. Inside these invisible highways, billions in product flowed northward while weapons and currency poured south. Each shipment was its own military campaign, meticulously logged, insured by blood, and executed with chilling precision. Then came the drones, small, silent, deadly. What began as reconnaissance tools quickly became airborne weapons. Modified consumer drones carried grenades or improvised explosives, dropping them onto rival convoys or police checkpoints with startling accuracy. Some were equipped with night vision cameras, others with heat sensors stolen from military surplus. They hovered above safe houses like mechanical vultures, relaying every movement back to encrypted feeds. Commanders could now direct attacks from miles away, an evolution of violence that no law enforcement had anticipated. In the airwaves, another battle raged. Encrypted radio frequencies pulsed across states, sometimes mimicking police channels, sometimes jamming them. Coders wrote auto-wiping scripts to delete traces of communications after use. Phones were rotated every few days, SIM cards tossed into rivers. The very language of command changed, code names replaced names, emojis replaced coordinates, and silence became a form of signal. The cartels were no longer improvising, they were innovating. But every leap in technology brought new paranoia. With drones came counter-drones. With encryption came betrayal. Whole crews were wiped out after a single compromised message, entire shipments lost to miscommunication or deliberate leaks. Both sides accused the other of planting informants within coding teams, of bribing the very hackers they hired. Warfare had become digital, faceless, endless, unforgiving. As the war matured, its reach widened. Neither cartel operated in isolation anymore. Jalisco's network stretched southward, alliances with remnants of Central American gangs, weapon suppliers in Eastern Europe, chemical producers in Asia. Containers that once carried electronics now hid precursors. Currency laundering shifted into cryptocurrency, property holdings, shell corporations. The scale had outgrown its geography. The world was now a participant, whether it admitted it or not. Meanwhile, Sinaloa, older and more embedded, turned inward, not retreating, but reorganizing. They relied on their legacy infrastructure, old alliances, familial loyalty, and deep political roots. Where Jalisco sought speed, Sinaloa invested in endurance. They bribed judges, funded mayoral campaigns, sponsored community projects, built schools. To the villagers, they weren't criminals, they were employers, benefactors, order in chaos. Corruption wasn't simply tolerated, it was systematized, legalized by repetition, made invisible by bureaucracy. And behind closed doors, politicians and police chiefs found themselves trapped in a double bind: refuse the money and lose their lives, accept it and lose their souls. Many chose the latter. Some officials became intermediaries, passing messages between rivals, orchestrating truces that lasted only long enough for rearmament. Every handshake left fingerprints on the war's machinery. By now, the violence had ceased to feel spontaneous. It was engineered, precise, scheduled, almost bureaucratic. Entire cities operated under curfews unspoken but understood. In Michoacan, residents learned to read silence. No music meant a patrol was near, fireworks meant a killing had been completed. In Jalisco, convoys traveled only at dawn, escorted by local police who pretended not to see. Every week brought a new incident: a mayor assassinated in his SUV, a journalist vanished after posting cartel videos, a town burned for defying an order. What once shocked the nation now merely trended for a day before vanishing into the algorithm. The cartels documented their own brutality, framing it as proof of governance. Bodies were arranged, filmed, edited with titles and music, then uploaded as declarations of control. The state's maps showed no progress, only new battlefronts. Civilians fled north, leaving behind ghost towns where only dogs and drones roamed. And amid this transformation, both sides realized the same grim truth: there was no single battlefield anymore. Every street, every phone, every conversation was now part of the war. Then, in a moment that seemed to promise an end, one of the leaders fell. His capture, or his death, depending on which version you heard, sent shockwaves through the networks. Commanders vanished, shipments halted, local cells panicked. For a fleeting week, headlines screamed victory, politicians paraded arrests, and citizens dared to believe the blood would stop. But power doesn't disappear, it divides. And within days, new factions emerged, loyalists regrouped, splinter cells formed, and the cycle began again, faster, more chaotic, more unpredictable. Because in this war, removing one head doesn't end the beast. It multiplies it. And when one leader fell, the battlefield didn't shrink, it multiplied. Where mornings were once measured in the ordinary rhythm of life, street vendors unfolding tarps, school bells calling children from tiled doorways, neighbors trading gossip over coffee, a new cadence took over, shutters closed before noon, markets emptied at the first rumor of trouble, and people learned to time their breaths around the sound of distant engines, because fear became the invisible clock that set every household schedule and taught entire towns to move like ghosts through a day that no longer belonged to them. In the countryside, the war's footprint was written across harvested fields left to rot and irrigation channels gone untended, with farming families who once rose with the sun now watching the horizon from inside locked houses, counting headlights instead of harvest rows, and bargaining every decision against the risk of a road that might now mean disappearance rather than commute, so that the land that had fed generations became a ledger of risk, measured in absences rather than yields. Hospitals, once places of routine care, found themselves stretched into improvised triage centers, corridors lined with stretchers, exhausted nurses moving from bed to bed under flickering fluorescents, relatives clutching rosaries and photos while doctors ration supplies, and ambulances forced to choose routes like generals choosing battle plans because one wrong turn meant being caught between checkpoints or targeted by a passing convoy, so in a place where saving life should be straightforward, every emergency became a calculated risk. Voices began to surface in the half-light, mothers whose sons texted home soon and then stopped, brothers who returned from work to empty chairs, schoolteachers who spoke in whispers about lessons uncompleted, and journalists collected these testimonies behind darkened lenses, blurring faces, and changing voices, because revealing identity could be a death sentence, so the stories themselves became a ledger of survival, small acts of testimony stitched together into a fragile archive of what life cost when the price of existence was silence. Entire families fled at night with suitcases and foam mattresses thrown into the backs of pickup trucks, grandparents carrying framed photos wrapped in cloth, children clutching stuffed animals as caravans crawled toward neighboring states, the road ahead uncertain and lined with the knowledge that some never reached safety, and the temporary shelters they arrived at, with rows of cots and shared food, were both refuge and crucible, places where new, fragile communities formed from the shared trauma of having to abandon everything they loved. Small businesses, the corner tiendas, the cobbler, the family-run taqueria, that once formed the economy's bloodstream found themselves paying invisible taxes, protection fees and extortion quietly siphoned what little profit remained while customers stayed away, and in windows and on doors a new script appeared, Serrato scrawled on paper, the simple word a declaration that trade had stopped and livelihoods had been traded for safety, so that economic collapse arrived quietly, through absence and unpaid bills rather than sudden headlines. Children were the unspoken witnesses, their chalk drawings of home replaced by maps of safe routes, their playgrounds empty, their voices learning silence as technique. Teachers either disappeared or worked from kitchen tables turning old homework into clandestine lesson plans while parents improvised education around curfews, and entire generations began to measure time by the number of checkpoints crossed rather than by birthdays celebrated, an education of caution in which survival became the core curriculum. Public services creaked and fractured, water deliveries stopped when roads were blocked, electricity outages became tools of intimidation, maintenance crews refused high-risk routes, and ambulances waited for escorts that never came, all composing an infrastructure of neglect where government absence felt indistinguishable from malicious intent, and communities were left to barter with whoever enforced the streets for basic survival, groceries, clean water, medical attention, turning life into a series of transactions dictated by threat. Those who tried to tell the truth discovered new dangers. Reporters' offices emptied after break-ins, footage disappeared from memory cards, anonymous threats arrived at dawn, and local editors, faced with the choice between publication and the safety of their staff, often chose silence. The result was a public record that read like a skeleton of the real story, and what remained were whispers, encrypted chats, and a patchwork of redacted reports that only hinted at how deep the rot ran across institutions meant to protect the people. And beneath all this grief and displacement, a darker commerce began to form, investigations that paused where money paid off prosecutors, private investigators offering results at a price, witness protection programs with fine print and exclusions, and courts that sometimes functioned as stages for performance rather than instruments of truth. So as we close this act, the question presses like a stone in the throat of every mother lighting a candle, when justice itself becomes a commodity. Who can afford to buy back the lives that were taken? By mid-2024, the foundations under both cartels were already trembling, old loyalties fraying, long-standing alliances unraveling in whispers and in blood. Within Sinaloa, the schism between Los Chapitos, the children of an imprisoned kingpin who once moved like a shadow across continents, and the Mayito-aligned factions loyal to an older, quieter operator became more than a feud and began to look like a slow, deliberate civil war within the cartel itself. Fights over the richest routes, the most profitable protection schemes, the docks that suddenly meant the difference between a decade of influence and complete collapse. Those who once raised glasses together at private ranches now kept lists of names to be punished, and secret recordings, voice notes captured in the night, short clips of meetings recorded on discarded phones, intercepted radio chatter, started surfacing on encrypted channels and in the hands of reporters, each file a lit match threatening to burn decades of careful arrangements. In that same period, investigative journalists and federal sleuths began to publish documents and internal memos that pointed to more than just street-level scheming. They suggested collusion at higher levels, prosecutors delaying exhumations, forensic reports altered or simplified, police logs with missing entries, and when a high-profile local political opponent was first labeled the victim of a petty robbery and later tied, through leaked blood forensics, to a ranch linked to cartel operatives, the public's trust in official narratives began to crack in ways that were impossible to mend with press releases. Government and international security assessments, including those circulated quietly among allied agencies, would later describe a pattern that felt systemic, a network of corruption where officers, judges, and mid-level bureaucrats were paid, threatened, or co-opted into letting shipments pass or investigations stall. It was not a collection of isolated incidents but an ecosystem in which contracts and favors kept the trade flowing, and when the DEA's public reports and investigative outlets began to map those connections, it exposed the war's real engine: money laundering, insider tip-offs, and a culture of bribery that made certain zones effectively permissive for violence. Then came defections, mid-level commanders who once kept careful ledgers deciding that loyalty had become too costly, or that their family's safety trumped old oaths. Some were arrested after rival tip-offs, others walked into the arms of prosecutors with dossiers of names and transaction records in exchange for protection, and when a major capture or a sudden surrender rippled through the press, arrests paraded as victories, the public rejoiced briefly, but as plea agreements leaked and some defendants quietly returned to influence from within prison walls, citizens learned the bitter lesson: arrests rarely solve structural markets of violence. At the same time, international pressure increased, asset freezes, extradition requests, and sanctions following the publicization of financial trails that intertwined with foreign banks and shell companies. But each legal action created a counter-effect. As leaders anticipated pressure, they adapted by decentralizing operations, shifting to cash couriers, crypto intermediaries, and opaque front companies. The law's reach had become a chess piece on a board that the cartels were learning to play better than many states believed. As these defections and arrests gathered headlines, a deeper story emerged in investigative series and leaked cables, that some officials at municipal and even state levels were choosing sides privately, funneling intelligence to one faction or another, enabling movements, and in some cases staging narratives to protect political careers or local power structures. The reports described missing warrants, altered bullet trajectories in forensic reports, and a string of funerals where the testimonies stopped short because the grieving feared retaliation more than they desired justice. Often these acts were invisible to the casual observer, not a single dramatic cover-up but 1,000 small compromises, evidence bags misplaced, CCTV footage corrupted, witnesses labeled unreliable, and prosecutors quietly reassigned. Each omission was a betrayal, and together they formed a mosaic. The state's promise to protect was being sold, piece by piece, to the highest bidder or the most threatening gun. Then, late in the confrontation, the death or capture of a senior security chief inside a notorious faction was announced with fanfare, a tactical success, politicians claimed, a turning point, the headlines said, but behind the parade of photos and press conferences, sources whispered of an internal leak, a betrayed route, a list of safe houses and daily patterns folded and passed to adversaries. Insiders who once swore loyalty had turned, whether from fear, money, or revenge, and their decisions split territories into dozens of new microfactions, each hungry, each untested, and every one more dangerous than the last. The headlines asked for winners. The people on those streets asked for peace. What actually happened was far more complex. When loyalty shifted and the inside betrayed the inside, the conflict didn't calm, it multiplied. And the biggest betrayal came from inside their own ranks. As the smoke of open battles cleared from highways and city blocks, the war quietly migrated into courtrooms, agencies, and diplomatic corridors. Federal prosecutors in Mexico began filing charges against cartel leaders, extradition requests floated across borders, and foreign governments pressured for cooperation. But behind every headline was a labyrinth of treaties, red tape, conflicting jurisdictions, and the unspoken question: How many hands inside the government were already tied to the same networks they were supposed to dismantle? Arrests made for public consumption masked deeper games. A kingpin paraded in handcuffs, yet months later released or transferred, cases dismissed for procedural errors. Trials moved slowly, evidence disappeared, witness lists changed, and convicting cartel money men often depended on testimony from those who already switched sides. The optics of justice mattered as much as the verdicts, and the public came to see arrests less as closure than as opening moves in a theater of accountability that seldom delivered on its promises. In legislatures, politicians scrambled to respond. Emergency decrees, new anti-cartel task forces, military operations announced with fanfare. But each initiative carried ambiguity: who really controlled the funds, how far the chain of command reached, and whether local officials were themselves compromised. Some governors declared autonomy from federal mandates, some mayors were exposed and leaked tapes receiving donations from cartel fronts. The war didn't end at the border, it seeped into ballots, budgets, and backroom power deals. Yet despite high-profile captures and press conferences, new cartels sprouted from the ashes like hedge thorns. Splinter cells, once lieutenant gangs, rebranded themselves, alliances recombined with smaller groups from neighboring states, old family lines sent children to lead new factions. The network mutated. Jalisco cells branched into Nuevo Leon, Veracruz, even central states, while parts of Sinaloa reconstituted under new leadership, adopting tactics they once opposed. The war was not over, it was evolving into unrecognizable shapes. International pressure pushed borders inward. The U.S. deployed task forces, the DEA coordinated wiretaps, the European Union froze assets suspected of laundering drug money, banks flagged suspicious transfers. But cartels responded by diversifying: cryptocurrency, trade in minerals, fake import-export firms. When one financial artery is closed, 10 more open. The war expanded from physical to fiscal, and the battlefield became global ledgers instead of roads. Meanwhile, in Mexico City, secret files leaked, black budget expenditures, unaccounted arms shipments, intelligence reports redacted. Some named officials who allegedly met with kingpins, others showed coordination failures between federal and state agencies. The classified documents hinted at complicity, negligence, even chains of command that never truly changed hands, and in leaked audio, voices discussed raids timed to shift public eyes, not disrupt supply chains. The center held these secrets, and the deeper we looked, the more we saw how deep the roots ran into the system itself. In some regions, the state's presence receded entirely. Governors ceded territories to cartel influence under the guise of pacification zones. Municipal police forces morphed into cartel auxiliaries. In towns where you once saw federal patrols, now only pickup trucks with tinted windows rolled. In others, local councils were dissolved, replaced by community boards that answered to new authorities. The line between public power and cartel power blurred until they were difficult to tell apart. Yet for all the announcements and midnight raids, for all the arrests that made front-page photographs, the national statistics told a different story: homicides ticking upward, disappearances climbing, seized drugs replaced by new traffics. The war didn't taper, it metastasized. When one region stabilized, 6 more destabilized. The center launched operations, but the gravity of violence simply shifted. And as power vacuums opened, warlords carved out new districts, and the cycle renewed itself without a single ceasefire yielding lasting peace. In one such region, a former lieutenant-turned informant claimed to have recordings, not just of logistics, but of meetings between cartel operatives and public officials. Evidence that suggested some raids were intentionally timed, some arrests symbolic, and some prosecutions window dressing. He said the war's real ledger was not in the prisons, but in the files, the contracts, the budgets, the call logs. And the document he handed investigators reportedly included names no one expected, names that challenged the narrative of conflict, and hinted at deals cut behind closed doors. At that moment, many believed the war had peaked, that arrests were turning points, that power would revert, that justice might hold. But as investigators poured through those files, one truth crystallized: nothing is ever solved in a war this deep. In fact, the greatest revelations were yet to come, because the files tell a different story. And as the final act begins, we will open them. When investigators cracked open the sealed files, contractors' ledgers, encrypted meeting logs, telephone traffic records, redacted memos, what emerged was a ledger of arrangements that redefined the conflict, bargains struck during ceasefires, shared shipments that changed hands mid-route, overlapping ownership of smuggling corridors, and names previously untouchable now implicated in payments, alliances, betrayals. What looked like war between two cartels now looked like partitioning of influence. A covert collaboration masked this conflict. One memo revealed that during a truce period in early 2025, shipments from Jalisco Territory were passed through Sinaloa safe houses under cartel code names. Another audio log captured a purported meeting between high-level operatives of both groups negotiating a territorial swap, and under it all, financial transfers flowed sideways, not just up or down chains. The war was being managed as a network, not fought as a clash. The spilled blood was collateral, the real goal was control of every node in the system. So when the public assumed the war was winding down with a kingpin behind bars or a major bust in Mazatlan, the files whispered a different story. The kingpin was shifted, not removed, corridors were partitioned, not contested, and the rise of smaller factions was not chaos, but methodical delegation. New groups grew not from empty space, but from carefully drawn edges of a reshaped map. One war, many borders, unlimited possibility. But the consequences were not just technical, they were personal. A family that protested a disappearance found their case assigned to an investigator linked in the files. A journalist whose leaked article exposed a politician was reassigned within the media network connected in cross-metadata logs. Human rights cases filed for victims of a massacre shared reference numbers with investigations into bribery. It was not coincidence, it was architecture, the war's blueprint written through policy, court, and pardon. When we say this war never ends, that's not hyperbole. In one province, a cartel announced it was dissolving, only to be replaced immediately by 5 microcells using the same routes, same contacts, same code words. In another, convicted leaders still receiving feigned visits in prison were captured in the files coordinating covert logistics through compromised guards. The battlefield multiplied not because violence escalated, because power outlived the bodies that produced it. And so we arrive at this moment, a war whose shape is not only bullets and borders, but contracts, compromises, and corridors you cannot bomb. We've followed phone logs, traced banners, heard testimonies, watched allegiances shift, but the deepest conflict remains the one you cannot see. It's system versus humanity. Influence versus evidence. And in that dark ledger, the missing still wait for justice, the broken still wait for peace, and the scale continues to tip toward whoever learns to write the rules. We tell this story not because violence should be sensationalized, but because silence is its greatest accomplice. These cartels don't simply kill bodies, they smother voices, compromise institutions, and reconstruct society in their image. To read their ledger is to see that behind every gunshot lies a signed page, and behind every banner hangs a contract. You've seen some of that tonight. If you're watching now, thank you, because telling truth is also a form of resistance. The next step is not just watching but questioning. Who holds the files now? Which alliances fabricated front lines? What levers remain hidden in plain sight? Because this war does not end when the cameras stop rolling, it ends only when accountability outlasts fear. If you want to see beyond the bullet, beyond the banners, beyond what they want you to believe, the files are out there, slowly leaking, slowly unraveling. Over time the full ledger may be revealed. But the moment you asked this question, the moment you listened all the way here, you began to see the edges of that ledger yourself. So as the screen fades, remember, the war's story is never just in bullets, it is in data, in decisions, in documents concealed behind walls. Tonight we open some of those doors. But there are more waiting. Thank you for watching Inside Sinaloa vs. Jalisco, Mexico's bloodiest cartel war. If you want to read the files yourself, check our sources. Subscribe. Watch closely. Because when the war seems quiet, that is exactly when its plans are being written. Before this story fades to silence, Ask yourself, how many more names will be erased before someone demands to see what's hidden behind the headlines? How many families will wait by a phone that never rings, while governments issue new statements, and the cycle repeats with different faces, different uniforms, but the same shadows? The only weapon stronger than fear is attention, your attention. Because when millions of eyes refuse to look away, the darkness has nowhere left to hide. Subscribe, share this story, and amplify every voice buried beneath it. Your single click doesn't end a war, but it keeps the truth alive, forces accountability to stay in focus, and tells those who control the silence that we are still watching. Don't scroll past, stay, question, remember, and speak. Because every view, every word, every second you choose to look closer, pushes the light a little further into the dark.